Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Xianyun post-release analysis. Xianyun is an interesting character. There's a lot of teams that she can end up working with, and we're going to be talking about a lot of those. So for those of you who haven't seen one of the post-release analysis videos before, what I do is I go through the pre-release video, we look at what I got right, what I got wrong, so let's get right into it. I mean, first off, when I initially recorded this, it was before the buffs. Her plunge buff started at 170% of her attack, then it went to 180, and then it went to 200. And the website that I usually use to look at leaks, like to look at leaked databases, Project Amber, hadn't been updated for the latest version. But yeah, that being said, from what I've heard, the developer from Project Amber has stopped updating the website, unfortunately. So I just wanted to very quickly thank them for all of the work that they've done so far. Project Amber is the website that I've been using to look at not just leaks, but just any stats that I need. I think it had the best UI of any of them, and it will be missed. So thank you for your work, and good luck in your future endeavors. Anyways, let's keep going. If I just try to spam plunge attack, you have to go through the whole plunge animation before you can jump again, which makes your plunges relatively slow. That plunge animation is different based on what weapon type you have. Okay, yeah, one thing I don't know if I ended up mentioning in this video is that Albedo and Bennett have a unique plunge attack animation that is different from other sword users, and it's actually a lot faster. And so later on I'll talk about using Bennett as a plunge character with Xianyun, and part of what makes it so good is that his plunge attacks are actually quite a bit faster than other sword users. However, you can dash cancel this end lag for your plunge animation. Instead of plunging at this speed, you can do it this speed. However, polearm characters can't actually dash cancel the end lag of their plunge attack. But they can do something else, which is they can normal attack cancel the end of that end lag, and then they can cancel that normal attack and do something like this. You can also do normal cancels with other weapon types, but normal cancels are generally worse than dash cancels, which is why it mostly matters when you can't dash cancel, like for polearm characters. But that is also something you can do with Ayaka or Mona, because their alternate dashes make it so that dash canceling is really bad, because you're gonna have to go through the whole dash animation before you can jump again. Whereas with other characters, you can jump mid-dash, right? I could just do... But if I'm using Ayaka or Mona... Alright, so... it takes a while before you can get it again. One thing that you might notice is that this number, right, this base number, is actually a decent amount higher for Claymore characters than it is for other characters. But Claymore characters aren't any slower at doing plunge attacks than other characters. The Claymore characters kind of just have an inherent advantage. And then another advantage that Claymores have is this. I don't know if you guys are seeing, which is very, very easy to get with Claymores. I'm getting 874 and 1007 there, right? Which is a bit harder to get on other weapon types because the hitbox is just smaller. I got it there. I didn't get it there. I got it there. I got it there. I got it there. I got it there. Cause like I'm not like at the perfect angle. But as soon as I'm not at the perfect angle anymore, I stop getting this second hit, right? Okay, about collision plunges, I had a comment on the video that I ended up replying to that said that they're actually the exact same size. And honestly, I don't know. I don't know that that's wrong. That being said, because of the way that Claymore characters, when they're doing plunge attacks, right? The collision, the explosion, right? They're holding their weapons in front of them like this. Whereas polearm characters are just holding it on them like this. Well, I'm not gonna, but yeah. We can do editing magic like this. So it is possible that the actual hitbox size is the same, but you end up getting collision plunges a lot more reliably with Claymores, in my experience, because it's shifted towards the front, and usually enemies aren't standing directly under you. But I definitely have noticed that in practice, you get collision plunges a lot more often on Claymore characters. But it is very possible that the actual size is the same and that what I said wasn't actually true here. Diluc's elemental skill and elemental burst are not very good, but Diluc has the highest plunge multiplier in the game. And so what you can do is you can build a team around Diluc vaping his plunge attacks. Yeah, I mean, we can actually compare that to what you're actually getting. Okay, business? Right, so I'm getting nice. So here I'm getting 80k. That's without the pyro plunge, but with the VV. So if you're not doing a VV setup for him, alright, 150k now, 160k. Plus whatever collision plunge you get. And obviously, yeah, my Xianyun is not currently on the Song of Days pass, I think. She's on VV. That is going to affect the damage. If you're not doing VV setups, you will obviously not want to be using VV. Well, that's not necessarily true, because you kind of still want VV for Furina's damage. VV is fine, but you can get higher damage. Anyways, if you are doing a VV setup, alright, 200k, 230, 218. And for context, right, my talent's level 8. This is my stat line. But yeah, so it is a decent amount higher. I will say though, you don't get that many plunges if you are doing VV setups, right? And the VV setups can be unreliable. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I just want to give context to like the increase that you get. Anyways, that's one of the things that you can do with Xianyun. And one of the nice advantages of it is that it is even good enough to clear with it with a lot of bad fucking characters. You can use characters like Furina, you can use even characters that don't have synergy, just if they're a melee character that can take advantage of Bennett's Constellation 6 to Pyro Infuse, they can work. Yeah, I stand by this. I think this is very accurate. There is a relatively noticeable difference between the characters that have crit ascension and good motion values, and the characters that have like HP ascension and not the greatest multiplier on the plunge, right? Like these are definitely things that are noticeable when you play them. But even if they are noticeable, like the characters that have lower stuff are still relatively serviceable. Like you can still clear with it for sure. Yeah, EM Ascension is also a good one. Yes, that's true. Another thing that you can do is use characters like Hu Tao that already implement jump cancels in their combos. So you can get up to 8. I think technically it's possible to do 9 if your machine input whatever, but 8. You can get up to 8. If you have Constellation 1, then you can do dash cancels, and that can let you weave in a couple more, up to about 10. If, on the other hand, you have a jump buff, and you do plunge attacks with the same combo, the same N2C jump, but you just do plunge attacks now, what do you get? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can get up to 5. So one thing I want to say about this is that the amount of charge attacks that you can get on Hu Tao when you're doing jump cancels or when you're doing dash cancels will always depend on how early you're doing your cancel. If you cancel like this, you're not going to get as many as if you cancel like this. Right, I mean, that's fairly obvious. But when you're doing plunge attacks, you do actually have some control over AoE. But the fact that you have some AoE means that sometimes you'll want to position yourself so that your plunge attacks hit multiple enemies. And when you do that, you might do that through letting your charge attack go through a little bit longer so that you can position yourself in the middle of enemies. If you're doing that, then it can be possible that you end up losing your infusion in the middle of your plunge animation for the last one. And when you're only doing 5 or 6 plunge attacks in your rotation, losing one is a pretty big hit to your damage. So that is something to be on the lookout for when you're playing these teams. So, without looking at the Xianyun damage on the Ascension 4, how much damage are you getting just from Hu Tao on these combos? So before looking at any reactions, this new N2CJP is almost as good as Hu Tao's C1. If you're looking at reactions, N1 and N2 being able of not vaping, so you need unvaped, N2 unvaped. Oh yeah, also, I was using N2CJP for the assumptions here. You can do N2CJP or N1CJP, they're both fine. N2CJP is better if you actually get the charge attack that you can get after your 5th plunge, but it's worse if you're not. They're basically very, very similar in damage. They both have a wiggle room of execution. Point being, they're similar enough that it doesn't matter too much. But yeah, you can do whichever one. The best way to look at Hu Tao with Xianyun, when you're playing specifically the Furina teams, it's basically always an upgrade. However, if you already have C1 Hu Tao and are playing her in non-Furina teams, then the upgrade is a lot harder to justify. Okay, another thing that I don't think I ended up talking too much about in this is using Hu Tao with Xianyun and what your other Hydro units should be. So obviously, as I already mentioned, like you kind of really want to be using Furina, but you want to be running double Hydro, and then it's either Xingqiu or Yelan. In my experience, things can go right with Yelan as the second Hydro, and I have had times where I didn't actually lose a vape on a charge attack or a plunge attack, but in most situations I would end up losing one or two. Now when you're losing one or two because of the damage buff you get from Yelan, it's still a reasonable option. That being said, especially once you start being in AoE, where Furina's Hydro app is going to be spread between different enemies, you can start losing more than one or two. And once that starts happening, then it's not really worth using Yelan anymore. On top of that, you don't have nearly as much defensive utility as if you're using Xingqiu. When you're looking at Xingqiu versus Yelan in those Hu Tao Xianyun teams, with Xingqiu you get better app and the defensive utility. With Yelan you get better damage. Now, that better damage is conditional on you not losing out on too many vapes. The more you lose out on vapes, the less you can justify using Yelan in the slot. Overall, I'd say that generally you don't lose too many vapes. I've found that it's anywhere between like 0 and 2 that you lose out on vapes on either plunge or charge attacks. If that's what you're losing out on, it's still fine, but it's like barely better, and you don't have defensive utility, so I'd say that overall it's worse. And so because of that, I think overall Xingqiu is still a better option, but it is a double Hydro team, so you don't necessarily need it. Even if you will lose out on a couple vapes, Yelan is still a better option for just overall damage. So they're both very, very viable. You can really use whichever one you want. If you want the defensive utility, go Xingqiu. If you don't, you can go Yelan. If you don't have Yelan, you can go Xingqiu and not have to feel bad about it. Another thing that I should mention here is you do end up getting a lower total amount of Xingqiu or Yelan procs. And so these numbers, right, that are showing you the amount of damage that Hu Tao is doing are not actually accurate to the amount of damage your team is doing, because you're losing some damage on Xingqiu or Yelan from doing these plunge combos that do normal attacks a little bit less often. They're still better, but these aren't perfectly accurate representations of the DPS increase. So I just wanted to point that out.
But I do want to, clarify that the teams aren't worth playing already with Gene. They're good teams. Just because I'm not a huge fan of them and I don't think that they're necessarily the best Hu Tao teams, doesn't mean they're bad. They're already good Hu Tao teams, and with Xianyun, they'll just be better.
That's a fair point. Hu Tao teams with Furina were already good before Xianyun came out, and Xianyun just gave them a little boost, which is nice.
Tao is one of the biggest winners from Xianyun's release, where she just gets a bunch of free damage, and because you can dash by jumping. There's a lot of attacks that only have hitboxes on the ground, and that are going to be pretty easy to dodge just from doing your combos.
Okay, so yes, that is true, but it brings me to a point that I did not mention in the pre-release and that I should have, which is that plunge attacks have an AoE that isn't that large, but also isn't that small. They have a medium-sized AoE that only hits the ground, which means that enemies that fly can just dodge the damage. And that's something that many of you may have noticed in this Abyss against the Ruined Serpent or the Winad. Sometimes your plunge attacks just don't deal damage because the enemy's standing just a little too high. And it feels like shit.
Because next I want to talk about Yunjin. And I chose Yunjin because she has all of the characteristics that should make her dog shit with Xianyun. She has nothing in her kit that is really useful to increase her plunge damage. And I took Yunjin and I looked at the sort of results you should be able to expect in a team where you use Yunjin, Furina, Bennett, C6, and Xianyun. And obviously it wasn't good, but it was surprisingly decent.
Okay, now that she's out, we can actually show that team. I will say my Yunjin normal attack talent is level 1. Alright, so talent level 1.
Strike cloud confirmed. Go in. Yeah.
Right, so as you can see, even with the character with the least amount of synergy, it still works. It's not great, and that's not the point I'm making, because one thing you may have noticed is my energy's kind of scuffed here. Like, I would have to probably have something closer to 25, 26 second rotation, maybe even a little bit more than that. But the point that I was making was that the way that plunge attacks work, the way that Xianyun's buff works, can make any character somewhat playable as a carry. Any character that can get the Pyro Infusion from Bennett C6 at least. And another thing I wanna point out is even when you're not playing a character that's infusible with Bennett C6, or if you don't have Bennett C6, there's even other options. So, and this is actually a team that I've been playing a decent amount, just from a character being able to trigger a multiplicative reaction, so Vapor Melt. You put them with Xiangling, and even without a complicated setup, right, even if you're not getting any swirls,
Teamwork is dreamwork.
we're still plunging for here 120k. 135k. It's enough to clear shit. I'm using Neuvillette here to show this instead of a character like Barbara, because my Neuvillette is actually leveled up and has crown normal attacks, whereas my Barbara isn't leveled up and doesn't have crown normal attacks. If you were to be playing Barbara, you get a little bit less damage because she has slightly lower base attack and doesn't have crit ascension, but it would still be alright. Like, definitely good enough to clear. Show her regardless? I can, but again, right, keep in mind, she is very much not leveled up. And by the way, this is not like actually the way that you should do your setup.
Nice and spicy. Let's light
Because you would want to get your power swirl in a team like this at the very least. But my point is just like, right, even with a level 60 Barbara, level 2 talents, it's still good enough to clear. It's not great, it's far from great even, but it is actually playable. If you really like Barbara and you want to play her as a carry, you have a way that isn't that cope to do that now.
But if you have Bennett C6 and Furina, Xianyun can make any dogshit character that you really like, but that just isn't really good in any of the teams you play, have a team where they can potentially clear Abyss in time as a carry on field, but only the ones that can be infused by Bennett, so polearm, swords, and
Yeah, and I should have added, as you can also do that if you don't have Furina, with cryo and hydro characters that have self-infusions, and that's not reliant on Bennett C6.
So first, Raiden, again, Xianyun's wording is ambiguous. What that means is you should not assume that it will work. It is a possibility that
Yeah,
it will
it
work.
doesn't work.
Does that mean that Xianyun is unplayable with Raiden? Unironically, no. Xianyun will still be playable with Raiden because Raiden's plunge combos are slightly better than her non-plunge combos. That being said, you are using a slot that could instead be used by a character that gives you something else, like Kazuha, for example, could be giving you a lot more personal damage than Xianyun, on top of a bigger buff. So is it going to be better than her current best options? I don't believe so. But is it going to be an option, for example, when you're playing her in a Furina team where you need a healer?
Yeah, that is basically the main takeaway for her with Raiden, is because the buff doesn't work, it's not that great. But because she's a full team healer and Bennett isn't, it can still be a good option with Furina when you need a healer. And her longer animations compared to Jean aren't that big of a deal for Raiden because you are actually gaining something from being able to do plunge attacks. On top of that, Raiden generating a lot of energy means that you can get away with lower ER requirements on Xianyun, which means that you can actually use TTDS on her and still get at least some value out of her being on the team.
It may be a surprise to some of you guys that Bennett is a really good f***ing carry. When you are using Xianyun, you'll be able to alternate between using your normal attack and using your E. Or sorry, using your plunge attack and using your E. And do something like this. Obviously, you'd have Cloud Retainer instead of Zhongli.
But yeah, we can actually, again, right? We can actually show how much damage this is now.
strike a pose. Let my name echoes. Here comes the catch. Gotcha. Make way for the adept. Teamwork is dreamwork. adventure time.
A 150k there.
Let's light it up. Stray clouds converge. Everybody stand back. Let's light it up.
You can see, right? It's a pretty good team. The biggest downside with this team is that Bennett's gear is very different than it is in other teams, which means that every time I want to play it, I have to gear Bennett, and it's very annoying. Anyways, point being, yes, indeed, that is a good team.
But from what I've seen, it's looking like it might be Cloud Retainer's best team. And at the very least, it definitely will be one of Cloud Retainer's best teams.
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily the best team, mainly because Bennett's, and I mean, every character that doesn't have something in their kit that increases their plunges AoE tends to be a bit weaker once you get to AoE scenarios, compared to characters that do have ways of increasing their plunge AoE. I do stand by it being one of the best teams. I don't know if it's necessarily the strongest. Yeah, the fact that you're a circle impact means that against mobile enemies like this Abyss's Ruined Serpent and Nut, it doesn't feel as good, but it is at the very least definitely up there. I think that generally the three main teams that I've found to feel the best with her and where her presence is the most impactful have been Bennett Carry teams, Hu Tao teams, and Xiao teams. Okay, let's move to the overall conclusions on weapons and look at this. There's a lot of asterisks to TTS being best in slot for play. One thing I will add though is that I looked at the weapon options before the buffs to her Ascension passive, and before the buffs to her Ascension passive, then, well, you gained the same amount of value from TTDS's attack buff, but the amount of damage that you gained from her own attack being higher was lower, which meant that you didn't care about her own attack as much before that buff. You still do care about it, but yeah.
If you can reach your ER requirements that you don't need an ER weapon, there are very, very few teams that would rather use Coward Atlas over TD.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit less the case because of the buffs. I do still think that if your rotation allows for it, TTDS is better, but you don't care as much about warping your rotation to work with TTDS. And so it makes Coward Atlas arguably a little bit better than I said here, but I probably would still put it around there. One thing I do want to add is that, honestly, I don't know what came over me putting Fav this low. Fav is obviously great. It feels a little more comfortable, right? The fact that you can always end up killing enemies before your rotation is over means that going overboard on ER is always more comfortable than being exactly at the amount of ER you need. And so practically, I've been liking Fav quite a bit. I'd probably put Fav higher, but at the end of the day, right? These are the weapons you use for her, and there's not that insane of a difference if you are adapting your ER requirements between any of them.
Okay, well, I've talked about those ER requirements a lot, but how much actually are they? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is what it is, right? Her ER requirements vary a lot depending on her teams. Playing in a Xiao team with C6 Farazan, her ER requirements effectively aren't there. When you're playing a team with Bennett, C6, and Furina, and a non-fielder like Yunjin that doesn't generate any energy, your ER requirements are incredibly high.
Next thing I wanted to talk about, which is, I think that Xianyun does have one glaring weakness, and it's that she is significantly weaker if you don't have Furina.
You know, I actually didn't remember that I said that in the pre-release. I'm glad I did.
All of her good teams use Furina, and if you don't have Furina, I don't think that...
Okay, that's not true. I wouldn't say all of her good teams, but definitely most of her good teams.
Like, there are a few exceptions. There are teams that are alright with her that don't have Furina. There are even some teams that are good with her without Furina.
Okay, I said that. I'm gonna shut up. Pre-release Jeff is smarter than me, man.
I mean, mainly, you can look forward to high constellation Gaming teams. High constellation Gaming melt teams can do well with her without Furina.
Honestly, after having tested Gaming a lot, I don't know how much I like the melt teams. They're fine, but I mean, I'll do a Gaming post-release, so you guys can look forward to that, but they're okay.
I really do think that most of her good teams like using Furina.
Yeah. One thing I'll add here, I do think I kinda severely underestimated how good Neuvillette and Barbara would be just as on-field plungers with Xiangling. I don't think they're amazing, and I definitely don't think it's as good as playing Neuvillette in one of his traditional teams, but it's honestly not that terrible, and maybe more importantly, Barbara has a team now! Yeah, I mean, she was in Nilo Bloom too, but if you're actually someone who really likes Barbara, you probably want to actually have her be the one doing the damage. But anyways.
Moving on to artifact sets.
Yeah, I think there's maybe a bit more of an argument to run Song of Days Past in general than I gave it credit for here. I still think that she's generally better on VV, because there's some teams where you really want VV, and unless you want to change your build depending on the team, then the fact that VV is still a very viable option in the teams where you don't really want it makes it overall the best. But yeah.
Generally is going to be either attack, or ER attack. You don't really ever want to go for damage goblet because, again, her personal damage is fairly low, and the damage that you get from attack on her is pretty good. And there's nothing you'd want instead of ER or attack here. But for your circlet, you can justify a healing bonus circlet. It gives you, obviously, better healing.
Yeah,
Like
I mean,
circlet
it's fine, but it's still not what I'd recommend.
very pog. She is a nice healing option.
Yeah, so she is definitely a very good unit for Xiao. On top of that, the fact that Farazan is on her banner is also really nice for Xiao. Xiao teams in general have felt really nice with her. Because she gives crit rate to plunges, and because you ideally want to play the teams with Furina, and therefore can make use of Marechaussee, and that gives you crit rate, and because Xiao has a relatively limited amount of good weapons, and a lot of them give crit rate, and he has crit rate ascension. If you do want to play these teams, be careful that you're not overcapping crit rate on Xiao. If that's the case, you might be better off not going Marechaussee and going for a different set instead. But these teams definitely do perform well and feel good.
Time to shine. Make way for the useless. Disappear.
I got the annoying cryo aura here, but
We'll see about that. Yoo-hoo! Let my name echo in song.
and especially in content like the current Abyss First Sign, where there's a decent amount of AoE and the enemies are relatively, you know, not all that insanely close together, like somewhat spread apart. It feels really good, and yeah, it's a pretty strong team. But yeah, Bennett Carry, good. Hu Tao, double hydro, good, yeah. Diluc, alright. C6 Bennett plus anyone, fine. Aggravate, freeze, monohydro, taser, yeah. She's basically usable in basically every team. There's even some teams that I didn't actually include here, like she's playable in Hyper Bloom, like on plunging on Nahida or on your Electro Carry. She's usable in basically every team, honestly. I think that the main thing here that I would change now that I've actually tested her is I would probably actually have or consider Barbara to be a little bit better than fine. It's actually relatively alright.
So again, this is only pre-release information. This is pre-release thoughts, pre-release analysis. So I'm not as confident in my thoughts as I will be once I've actually tested her. So if you're relying on these to, you know, help you decide whether or not you want to pull, you should check out my day one testing or wait for the post-release video. But
Yeah.
that's gonna be it.
And now that I have the hindsight of, you know, having tested her, I think that this was actually a pretty accurate pre-release video. I relatively accurately portrayed what her weaknesses are. I didn't get too much into the nitty-gritty of how to do the setups, and honestly, I'm kind of glad I didn't, because I feel like in so many situations, actually doing your VV setups is kind of just not even worth it, because you're still doing good damage even if you don't do them, and if you do try to do them, it means that you lose Bennett uptime in order to get your setup, and that means that if you
it up, it just feels terrible. So I found that in a lot of situations, it's kind of just not really worth it. But obviously, if what you want to see is the biggest possible numbers, then your VV setups will be worth it. Overall, she's good. I am glad I got her. I've been enjoying playing her. If you want to know more about like my experience playing her, you can go check out the first impressions video if you haven't watched it already. Since then, I've actually played a decent amount of Sucrose carry. You know, Plunge Attacks Sucrose. I'm in the process of leveling her normal attacks to 10. We'll get that done soon. It's been pretty fun. Not as good as Xiao, but still pretty fun. Yeah, I think that overall, if you have Furina, she's a pretty good unit. If you don't have Furina, she's an alright unit that still has some use case. And if you don't like plunge attacks at all, then I don't know. Don't pull for her. At the end of the day, the main factor that goes into your decision on whether or not you pull for a character should always be whether you think you'll have fun playing them. If you don't have fun playing a character, then it's a video game, it's not homework. You shouldn't do that. But yeah, that's gonna be it for the post release, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.